Hey everybody, Brandon with Flyin Miata, back with another FM Live. And today we are gonna talk about bad mods. Maybe something that you read was good on the internet, suckered you in, and then wasn't actually any good. We're gonna maybe try to help save you from some of those issues. Now, as always, you have questions, drop them in the comments. If you agree with us, let us know. If you disagree or have your own bad mods that we missed, drop them in there, let us know. We always love to see that stuff and answer any questions. Now, I will preface this, you know, it's really weird. We don't actually have a lot of bad modifications in the building. So these are good examples, mostly, of modifications that could potentially be bad. So most, but not all, of these products are actually good products. So we'll start it off. Bad mod number one is a cold air intake as opposed to a cold air intake without the quotation marks. So what we call a filter on a stick. So basically, if you have a tube that goes across your engine and a filter on the other end of it, that's not really a good modification. So that's gonna suck in a lot of hot air, and hot air does not have as much oxygen in it, and oxygen is what actually burns in your engine. So that's what makes power. So we want true cold air. Now, maybe your cold air intake has a dyno chart saying it makes so much more power. Well, was that dyno run done with the hood closed? Because if no, and you drive around with your hood open, sweet, that is a valid test. However, if you drive around with a hood on your car and closed, that's not really a valid test. So we have our Randall intake that actually goes outside of the engine bay to suck in true cold air and also high pressure air. So that is a good, real cold air intake without the quotation marks. Another one, bad mod number two, is a catless exhaust. Now, cats get a bad rap because surely they suck up a lot of horsepower and they're terrible and so on and so forth. Not really. Now, the more power you make, it's going to make a bigger and bigger difference the more flow there is through there. And sometimes track only cars that are especially abusive, maybe those are better without a cat. But for track day cars, for anything that's street legal, obviously it's illegal to remove the cat from your car, but also it's not really getting you anything. It's not getting you anything good. So a test pipe versus a high flow cat such as ours isn't gonna cost you any power on a naturally aspirated car. Grassroots Motorsports actually did a really good test on this a few years ago. And you can see that the power is equal between a high flow cat and a test pipe and no catalytic converter, but obviously the emissions are much, much higher. Some of the stuff that you may not think of, but also kind of goes hand in hand. If you don't have a cat, your car is stinky. It smells much worse. It's not pleasant. And it can get a pretty raspy, kind of harsh tone to it as well. So cat provides multiple benefits. Along those lines, you want to be careful with exhaust. Exhaust can be really good. You know, we've got a full line of exhaust. We really like them. Make sure, you know, generally speaking, don't buy exhaust, at least on a Miata, to make a boatload of power. There are exceptions. You know, the Mazda Speed makes a bunch of power with our exhaust. ND2s also. But generally speaking, an exhaust is going to be more of kind of a style, a personal enjoyment kind of thing. It's going to make better sound. It's going to look good. It's going to last longer. It might make a little bit of power, but it's not going to make a giant amount of power. But you want to be careful because if you get the wrong exhaust, it can be really loud. It can be really droney. It can basically just give you a headache, be a headache literally and figuratively. Now, bad mod number three, again, high flow fans with the quotation marks. So one thing, and I did a whole video on this, so definitely check that out for kind of the nitty gritty. But the short version is just because fans look neat and have a nice aluminum shroud doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually any better than your stock fans. So Mazda did a very good job designing the car. They took care of a lot of things for us. And they did things intelligently. Like, for example, Fans are working against pressure because you have heat exchangers in front of them. So if your fan does not have enough torque to pull air through the heat exchangers, or at least pull it through at a greater rate than stock, then it's either equal to stock or worse than stock. We've actually had customers show up here and are overheating with aftermarket fans when they weren't with stock fans. Now, obviously, all of our fans do not fit that description. They all do pull quite a bit more than stock at the static pressures that we're dealing with when we're pulling through the heat exchangers. So this is one thing that I've said many times in the past, but the short version is, if your fan setup that you're looking at says I flow a bazillion CFM, but doesn't tell you what pressure that's at, it's garbage. That information doesn't mean anything, and it is highly, highly suspect. So bad mod number 4, lightweight flywheels. Now, we really like lightweight flywheels around here, but you have to be careful with them. If you go too light, the car can be really difficult to get started from a stop. Excuse me, you can get some bad NVH, noise, vibration, and harshness. So basically, when you're in gear, the clutch is engaged, and you come off the throttle, then it's just going to be a rattling sound from the transmission. Now, some of that, with our flywheels, you might get a little bit of it, but with a light flywheel, you'll get a lot of it to the point where it's really pretty disrupting and irritating. Now, if this is a full-bore track car, cool, doesn't matter. If it's something that you actually want to be reasonably streetable, that very much does matter. Another thing to bear in mind is that lightweight flywheels, they're great for rev matching, for engine braking, for basically just making it feel more like a sports car, but they have less inertia in them. So that means it's going to be harder to launch the car. If you're big into drag racing, lightweight flywheel's probably not ideal for you. If you have idle issues, you're kind of borderline, maybe you've got an old school supercharger that has an air-to-air intercooler, so now you've got a much bigger throttled volume, so your car is a little more borderline on whether it's going to stay running with idle issues and that kind of thing. A lightweight flywheel is going to make that even worse. So you want to be careful with that and go with lighter but not lightest, generally speaking. Coilovers. This is a fun one. So now by coilovers, yes, pedantic internet person, your stock Miata did come with coilovers, but we're using the vernacular here, meaning a threaded body with a threaded spring perch, not simply the fact that your spring coil is over your shock. So the first question to ask yourself is, do you actually need coilovers? Why are you buying them? What is the advantage there? So I say that because the main advantage typically to coilovers is adjustable ride height. Now that is fantastic for the ability to corner weight the car, but is that something that you need? It may be, but that's not really going to make any kind of difference for a street car, but it is going to make a significant difference for a track and a race car. So if this is a track car and you want to get everything dialed in and you're chasing tenths of a second, absolutely, coilover is a good coilover is a great option for you. But if it's a street car, you want a little bit lower ride height, you want better handling, but you don't really want to futz with it much, you probably don't need a coilover. One place where they can be beneficial is that, generally speaking, coilovers are going to have a little bit more flexibility in terms of the spring rates that you use. So they may have better valving, or a broader range of valving, because you have to make sure that the valving in your shock is sufficient to handle the spring that you put on it. The spring can be too soft or it can be too stiff for the valving that's in your shock. And if you get that equation wrong, your ride, your handling, everything goes out the window. The other thing is that coilovers are generally built around a more universal spring. So whereas something like our Stage 1 kit has a specific spring that is dimensionally, it's a stock format spring, we'll say. So this is custom wound for us, whereas these springs you just buy off the shelf. So you've got a little more flexibility in terms of playing with it there. Now, another thing to be very careful of, and Keith did an excellent video on this that we'll point you towards, but is two-piece coilovers. So this is one of the not awesome parts that's on the table here. So this is a two-piece coilover, and Keith's video is awesome. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but really the short version is that because the two-piece coilovers are great for the manufacturer because they can make one shock and put a different bottom and a different top on it and sell it to a bunch of different applications. They're bad for us as drivers because that means that the shock itself is very short. You know, it goes to, you know, we'll say here, whereas with our VMAX here, the shock itself, as in valving and shock shaft and all that kind of stuff, goes all the way to the bottom. That means that you have very little travel. You have much less travel with a two-piece setup than you do with a single-piece setup. For example, our NC Fox versus a popular two-piece coilover, the front shock is, the Fox has about an inch more travel, which is 20%, which is significant. But the rear, where it really matters, it has 3 inches more shaft travel versus this popular two-piece coilover. That's 60% more shock travel. Now what that means is that you are limited in your wheel travel, and it's kind of comical because whenever we get a car in the shop with a two-piece coilover setup and we put it up on the lift, the wheel drops from here when it's just sitting on the ground to here, which means that you have effectively no droop travel. What does that mean? When you have no droop travel, if you imagine a road and there's a dip in the road, and with our Fox setup, or with any of our setups, you have appropriate droop travel, so your chassis is going to stay roughly level, and your wheel has the ability to drop into that dip, so your chassis is going to stay a little bit, or your chassis is going to stay level. With a two-piece setup that doesn't have that droop travel, your wheel still has to drop into that dip, but now it's bringing the chassis with it. So instead of one of these, you get one of these. It's violent, it's upsetting, it is not comfortable for the car. So two-piece coilovers, excuse me, definitely a good thing to not do. Bad mod number 6, lowering springs that are not stiff enough. Now you want to be careful with the spring rate in general. So with coilovers, lots of times the quality of the damping is such that you can get away with a higher spring rate. There are limits, but you can get away with a higher spring rate. But one thing to bear in mind is that when you lower the car, assuming the shock geometry stays the same, you are losing compression travel. Now with our extended shock mount here, we get a bit of that back, get most of that back, I believe. But one thing a lot of lowering springs do incorrectly is that they don't run a stiff enough spring. So it sounds like, oh, I'm not driving on track, I'm just having fun, I really just want the aesthetics of a lower car. Cool, I get you, that makes sense, no worries. So therefore, I want a soft spring so that I still get that comfortable ride. No, that's flawed logic. So it seems like it makes sense, right? What happens is that when you lower the car, you lose that compression travel. And if you lose that compression travel and you don't increase the spring rate, all you do is sit on the bump stops. So basically, you went from from being able to compress the shock this much to now you can only compress it this much, but you don't have anything to keep you from compressing it enough. So you're just hitting the bump stops all the time. Miatas are very limited in travel, particularly in the rear. And your butt is really close to those rear wheels, so you feel it when you hit a bump hard. And with too soft of a spring rate, you're gonna hit the bump stops much more frequently and harder. So don't go too soft on your lowering springs. The corollary to that is that you can't put lowering springs on stock shocks or stock damping shocks, which is why we do not sell our lowering springs, which do have an appropriately but not overly stiffer spring rate than stock, but you need better damping to go along with that. So we sell them as a package with our Coney Sport shocks. There are other shocks that these springs will work with, but not stock shocks. So you cannot put our springs on stock shocks or any other shock that is intended for the stock spring rate. Coney Streets, Coney Special Actives, they're great shocks. We really like those. Use them with stock springs. Do not use them with our springs. They won't work. So, bad mod number 7, poly bushings. Now, as ever, this requires some explanation. There are lots of poly bushings out there, and they can be good for certain applications, but you want to be careful with them. So there are poly bushings that are used in motor mounts. Those are great for holding your engine in place and not letting them move around. They're also excellent at shaking out your fillings. So you want to be very careful with that and what your use case is. Is this a drift car? Sweet. Those should probably work really, really well for you. Is this a daily driver, canyon carver, needs to be reasonably comfortable kind of thing? Don't do those poly bushings because they're going to be very, very brutal. Now, some motor mounts have a much bigger puck and they have a softer durometer, so they can manipulate things to get it so that it's more comfortable. Poly control arm bushings, there's kind of a lot of back and forth on the internet here. Really, a lot of it comes down to quality. So the Super Pro bushings that we use have a special formulation for the material. They've got physical details to help retain the grease. They use a very high-end, fancy grease. So they're great. We don't have squeaking issues with them. They've got a lifetime warranty for the bushing, but also against noise. So it's basically just a non-issue. If you get the generic cheap stuff, probably not the case. You can keep them from squeaking if you lube them regularly, but is that a thing that you want to do? It's up to you. All right, bad mod number, what am I on? 8? End links. So the stock end links are either going to have a rubber bushing on the NA, excuse me, or ball joints on every other generation. Now, a lot of aftermarket end links will use Heim joints or rose joints, and they work fine. They can be a good option for a limited time. So the problem is that those wear out. They're underneath a car. They're, unless it's a track car where it's getting constant maintenance, never really driven in any kind of dirt or rain or anything like that. And if anything wears out, it gets replaced. If that doesn't describe you, you need some kind of sealing to keep that joint together and slop free for as long as possible. And that's what a ball joint is. It has the boot on here. These are our end links, of course. So they're sealed up. They are tight to start off with. They stay tight. They don't wear out, whereas that is not true of a lot of the Heim jointed end links. Those can wear out and get rattly over time. Rattly is more annoying than catastrophic, but it's not a good thing. It's kind of the short version. Okay, bad mod number 9, shock tower braces. So for one, a rear shock tower brace makes all the sense in the world for a Civic hatch that has no structure between the shock towers at the back of the car, or strut towers, I suppose. But a Miata has a lot of structure actually in the back. So they're shiny jewelry, but they're not really actually doing anything for the structure of the car. Front shock tower brace, on the other hand, can make a big difference to the structure of the car, the rigidity of the steering, and it is a pretty easy upgrade and also a beneficial one. But you got to do the right thing, as ever. So I have an example here for you. This is our shock tower brace. It's intelligently designed. It's made with stiff materials. The load paths have been considered, all that. It is very, very stiff. I don't think it's moving at all doing that. This is a Brand X shock tower brace. It has pivots here. This bar would be really strong if it were flipped 90 degrees, but it's not. It's in the wrong orientation. So if I do the same thing and push down on this, I mean, I'm not even trying as hard, and you can see how much it's moving. So one of our lovely coworkers pointed out that it wouldn't be moving so much if it were bolted in place. That is accurate. Also, this is supposed to make the chassis more rigid, as opposed to relying on the chassis for its rigidity. So this is another one that you want to be pretty careful about. I'm getting direction on the fly here. Here, we'll make it more visible for you so you can see how much that moves. So that is a very short list of bad mods. There are a lot more out there, but let's see what the audience has to say. What kind of questions, comments, emotional outbursts do we have? Roll bars versus style bars. You know, that was actually on my list and I cut it for time, so we'll add it back on. Don't buy a style bar. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Be aware of what you're getting into. Style bars are for style only. They provide zero rollover protection, and I would argue that they are going to make your life much worse if you do actually roll over. I am not a fan of them. I would immediately remove one from any car that I bought. If you want aesthetics and you're okay with the risk and you're aware that, you know, the risk is very low and it's definitely not doing anything for you other than style, cool, have at. But be aware of what you're getting into. Race car versus street car, that's something that I really should have kind of started off with. A lot of these things are, you have to consider what your use is. What do you want out of the car? What are your goals for it? If it's a race car, sweet. Still don't do the two-piece coilovers, please. But do a coilover with a stiff spring, a lightweight flywheel, all this kind of stuff. You know, maybe if it's a track only car, maybe you delete the cat because you don't want to have to replace it. So in that situation, awesome. So that, you know, there wasn't really a question in there, but basically make sure that you're considering what you want to do, what you want the car to be, and make sure that that modification, whatever it is aiming at that goal and not just, ooh, this is a shiny thing. You know, make sure, as they say, begin with the end in mind. Establish a goal and then make sure that everything you're doing to the car lines up with that goal. Okay. Also not really a question, but kind of. Okay. I read on a Facebook post that it's faster if I remove the rear sway bar. Maybe. A lot of that comes down to driving style and what your particular suspension setup is. So our suspension setups mostly are designed around our set of sway bars. You're supposed to use both of the sway bars together. They're a match set front and rear. And then the spring rates in question also come into play. Now, if you took one of our setups and you removed the rear sway bar from it, you are going to end up with a car that does not oversteer kind of at all, which means that it does understeer. Now, if that makes you more comfortable as a driver, if that's better for your specific setup, okay, more power to you. Personally, I don't like that setup. I don't like a wild amount of oversteer, but I like to be able to throttle steer, use the back end of the car, and not just kind of manage the front end as I'm going along. So some of that is personal preference. Some of that is also race class. Some classes allow you to put a new front sway bar, stiffer front sway bar on, but do not allow the same thing for a rear sway bar. So that can be good for responses, but bad for steady state cornering and making the car more likely to understeer. So, okay, I heard Rotella is the oil of choice. This is one that I cannot speak super intelligently on, so I will probably just defer. The short version is make sure that you're doing research into it. It is not intended as a gasoline oil. So there are, I believe, generally, so yeah, high zinc content. There's going to be some other drawbacks, particularly for emissions equipment and O2 sensors and such. And also there are lots of other really good options out there, such as Redline, that do not have any of those same drawbacks. So no, unless you have a diesel Miata, in which case, sweet, good choice. Yeah, so good question. So aero stuff, can I do one end of the car but not the other? There are others out there that can speak more intelligently on this than I, but generally speaking, you want to keep stuff balanced. If you add a wing but do not add a splitter, you're going to get more rear end stability, which is great, but then you're going to lose some front end stability and be more likely to pick up some understeer and that kind of thing. So doing one might be a baby step, but it is a stopgap to having a complete solution because you definitely need both parts on the car in order to get the best result. Miatas are race cars, so they should all have short shifter kits. You are absolutely right, which I will refer you back to an earlier comment is why Mazda put one in there in the first place. Personally, I'm not a fan of most short shift kits. It's a personal preference kind of thing. I find that the shift length is great on my stock shifter, and with short shift kits, the effort and the notchiness goes up to a point that I don't really like it. That said, they're also typically not breaking anything. So that gets into more of a subjective personal preference kind of thing, rather than it actually being a bad mod, if that makes sense. Yeah, all right. So I've got some questions ahead of time here. So at what point have I used too many chassis braces so that it results in an unnecessary weight gain? Good question. So some of that is kind of subjective, I guess. What I would say is don't double up on bracing and consider your concept. So I'm trying to think of how you could double up. Man, I'm kind of striking out. So basically, I really like a stiff chassis. It gives a better platform to the, it gives a better platform for the suspension to work off of. Fewer rattles and creaks. It just makes it feel a lot better. So I would do it all, and the weight gain is not substantial, not huge. But again, I can't come up with an example. But you know, don't put 2 shock tower braces on the car. That's not physically possible. But say it was, you know, 2 is probably not going to be much, if any, benefit to 1, assuming that it's a good one. So be careful with that. Yes.
The shock tower brace versus fender brace, maybe.
Well, shock tower brace and fender brace is kind of redundant, but also kind of not. It's probably the closest to redundant that you could get. And a shock tower brace is going to be a much easier thing to install, and a good fender brace, such as the strong arms that we sell, is going to be higher effort, probably a little bit higher on the result end of things, and kind of overlapping, but also kind of not. For me, I would still do them both. But if you're trying to be picky about it and lightweight is a major goal, yeah, maybe do just the fender braces and not the shock tower brace. Oh, that's a good one. 6-speed transmissions are better, period, end of story. 6-speeds are stronger. Yes, I do agree with that statement. If you need a stronger transmission because you are abusing it, I guess, but really because you're making a boatload of power, cool, more power to you. That's just what you have to do. I'm not a huge fan of the 6-speed. The shift quality isn't quite as good, and it's just geared shorter. I believe, isn't it like a Mazda speed is actually, from a gearing standpoint, one of the slowest Miatas out there. We're ignoring horsepower limitations. We're just looking at gearing, because the 6-speed is geared shorter all the way around, including the top gear, than a 5-speed. So what I find particularly, Logan behind the camera drives a Mazda speed, so he doesn't like this conversation. But particularly at our local track, I'm always in between gears. It's way too high, but if I shift into the next gear, it's not quite high enough in RPM. So 6-speed, absolutely, if you need it for strength handling. If you don't need it for strength handling, I'm talking NA and B here, I would stick with a 5-speed. That is a little bit subjective, but also a little not. Okay, what about weight gain from upgraded performance parts? Another excellent question. So you want to make sure that whatever the weight gain is, it is worth it to you. The chassis bracing is a good example. A stiffer chassis to work from so that the chassis deflects less and your suspension does exactly what it's supposed to do and doesn't have to worry about this other undefined spring that is the chassis flopping about. That is a good thing. It does come with a little bit of a weight penalty. So how focused are you on the weight? Why do you need it as light as possible? What kind of offsets do you have to that weight? You know, horsepower is an offset in terms of straight line, but horsepower is not an offset to weight gain in terms of cornering. You know, go drive a Challenger down a mountain road and then drive a Miata and tell me which one you enjoy more. So you want to be careful. Weight gain is not necessarily the devil to an extent, but you want to be very careful about that and make sure you're making it intelligently, making those choices intelligently. Is there such a thing as too big, brakes that are too big? Another good question. I'm proud of you guys. Yes, I would say there is. So the bigger the brake, the heavier the brake. Now that does come with an advantage in terms of thermal mass. So it's going to postpone overheating the brakes that much more, but it also means that you have to use that much bigger of a wheel and so on and so forth. And what do you actually need? You know, like our 6-piston brake kit is great, works totally fine on street cars. It's overkill for most people too. And you know, in terms of a driver feel on a street car, you're not really going to get much of an advantage with the 6-piston over the 4-piston because they both have a similar pedal feel, which is really, really nice, even on a street car. But that additional friction area and thermal capacity and so on isn't really going to be an advantage unless you really have the power and also the place to safely use the power to take advantage of it. So V8 track car, absolutely, you need that. Daily driver street car that never goes on track, our little big brake kit is an awesome upgrade. The 6-piston would work fine, but you don't really need it. Bigger rotors, again, if you have a need for that thermal capacity because you're going so fast, because, well, I can't remember the math, but basically speed is a bigger effect on braking input, stress on your brakes, we'll say, than weight. So if you're going fast enough to need a bigger rotor, then cool, you have to make those compromises, bigger wheels and so on and so forth. But if you don't, then you don't. So don't make your rotating assembly, your unsprung weight heavier than it really needs to be for your application. That's, again, that's really what it comes down to is there are bad modifications, just poorly engineered stuff, but for the most part, it is making sure that you're choosing the right parts for your application and your use. Yes, Mike. Okay, so Ethan says that the 1.6 is junk and the internet says he should swap it to a 1.8 and his feelings are hurt by this comment. So that's another subjective. It comes down to your goals and that kind of thing. The 1.6 is fun, it's revvy. There are a lot of people that absolutely love the engine. I do really like the engine as well. Also, doesn't make a ton of power. Also, if you throw the same amount of money at a 1.8 and a 1.6, you're gonna have more lag and less power on a 1.6. It's just physics. So is a 1.6 terrible? No. Is a short nose 1.6 terrible? I would also argue no. My wife had one with 250,000 miles on it and it was totally fine. You just have to be more careful with your maintenance. So that is a subjective thing, unless you're trying to make as much power as possible, in which case there's still some subjectivity, but you're just gonna make less power, same for same, on a 1.6 than you are on a 1.8. When are body kits a good idea? That is another good one. What is your definition of a good idea? And I don't say that facetiously. So if your goal is aesthetics, sweet, do whatever looks right to you. That's awesome. You know, pay attention to quality, be prepared for battles. Lots of times with body kits, you need to, you know, the fiberglass parts aren't exactly right and they need a little futzing and polishing and fitment help and so on and so forth. So that's just kind of part of it. But be prepared for that. From a strictly functional standpoint, that's going to be a little harder to define. You know, do you have wider wheels, higher offsets, so everything is stuck out, and now you need to cover those wheels? Okay, that's part of the equation. Do you need as much cooling air through the heat exchangers in the front of the car as possible? That's another part of the equation. So there's kind of two very different ways to look at that, aesthetics or functional. Functional is a little bit harder to justify, but you can make those justifications in specific situations. If you get adjustable control arms only on one end, so you have an adjustable upper control arm and a non-adjustable beyond stock adjustment lower control arm, then are you getting any benefit? Absolutely. So the benefit is in the adjustment. and you don't necessarily need to match adjustment upper and lower. You know, if you have an upper control arm, say we're talking about the front, and you have an upper control arm that has additional adjustment in it, and then you have a lower control arm that also has additional adjustment in it, now you just have double the adjustment, and you probably didn't need that. Also, adjustable for kind of rear, but really for front control arms, adjustable lowers make me nervous because there's a lot of load going through one point, your ball joint there. So if you've got, you know, an eccentric at the end or something like that, then that is carrying a lot of load that it wasn't really intended to carry. If you look at the stock setup, there are two eccentrics there. Now that does not mean that the load is split 50-50 because of geometry, but it also doesn't mean that one eccentric is carrying all the load. So anyway, it makes it much more likely for that to slip. So if it were me and I needed additional camber, I would very specifically only do an adjustable upper control arm, and I wouldn't do the lower adjustable control arm. Now there are different ways to skin that cat and all that kind of stuff, and there are some disadvantages to doing an upper adjustable control arm, such as decreased spring clearance or wheel clearance on the spring. So lots of pros and cons to consider there, but to answer the specific question, no, there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing an adjustable top and a stock bottom. Sorry. Bigger wheels are better. Nope. So there are advantages. Brake clearance, stiffer sidewalls, so sharper reactions, also stiffer sidewalls, and decreased ride comfort. But there is more weight, and that's the big one. Now the wheel weight matters. That's a thing for everyone. So it matters from two reasons. One of them is rotational weight. So if you've ever taken a bicycle wheel, you spin it and you hold onto it and then you try to change its direction, the bigger and heavier that wheel is, the more it does not want to change direction. So vice versa, the lighter and smaller that wheel is, the more it is willing to change direction. And since we are looking at nimble, fun sports cars that react exactly to our inputs, we don't want something that's going to be really sluggish and hesitant to react, so we don't want that heavy wheel. The other thing there is unsprung weight. So kind of going back to my example with the coilovers, but basically, if you look at the chassis, that is sprung weight because the wheel, let me start over again. The wheel follows the contours of the road. It has to be on the road at all times, or that's the goal. So it is unsprung weight because it's following every little dip, undulation, everything. And the goal is that the chassis is unsprung weight because the chassis is staying stable and the wheel is moving up and down because the suspension is damping that out. Now, what that actually means is the wheel is going to take a big hit and then the suspension is going to kind of gently do one of these. So the shock absorber is going to absorb the shock, and I'm not going to get into the semantics there. But point being, the lighter your unsprung weight is, the better it will follow those undulations in the road without kind of exaggerating the effects, I suppose you could say. And rotational weight is that much more that you have to slow down with your brakes. So lighter wheels equals that much less that you're stopping with your brakes. To wrap it up, Mazda did a really, really good job on all of these cars. If you're gonna modify anything, consider what you're doing, whether it's an advantage over what Mazda did and how it's an advantage, and again, whether that's an advantage for you and your use and your application, because what's amazing for this person will be absolutely terrible for that person because their uses are opposite. So pay attention to that. Don't modify something unless it needs to be modified for, maybe Mazda didn't get that part right, or I want to do this, or this part's worn out and I'm going to put a better one on, or whatever. Some parts are just poorly engineered, but a lot of parts are poorly chosen, so be careful with that. So, how did we do? If we did well, give us a like. If we didn't, drop it in the comments. Do you have other things that should have been on the list? Do you disagree with what we have on the list? Let us know. That's what the comments are for. And if you like this kind of thing, be sure to subscribe. We do this every week, so we will see you next week.